Now, folks, every time I read a secular history account of the history of ancient Israel, they always want to make a jab at the Bible, some point where they disagree, and your authors are no exception. Where they disagree with, they say that there never was a powerful kingdom in Israel under rulers like David and Solomon. I mean, I'm looking at it on page 27, where that they. But anyway, but others will make a different jab where they disagree. In fact, recently I read where that Abraham did not exist, and I have a little bit of a problem with that. In that, every one of you who are alive in this class had some ancestor who existed in 1800 BCE. If you didn't, you're not here. So if the Jews exist, and some people believe they have no right to, but if the Jews exist, they did have an ancestor or two right around 1800 BCE. Had to have, but they're not here. So the idea that Abraham didn't exist, I mean, you know, I have an intellectual problem with that. But they always make some kind of a jab. Anyway, according to their own history, the Jews began their history with the story of Abraham. That Abraham had started out in the region of Sumer in Ur, the city of Ur in southern Mesopotamia, and had migrated from Ur, become extremely wealthy, so wealthy that he was often envied by kings, and that his descendants became the nation of Israel. Now, I want to elaborate on that, but the word nation has the same root as nativity. It means people who are related by birth. Now, we in the United States do not think of that anymore, but originally the word nation was people who are descended from one couple, like the Assyrians. They were descended from Ashur, so they called themselves Assyrians. The Hittites were descended from Heth, so they called themselves Hethites or Hittites, and so on and so forth. So Israel descended from, well, a man named Israel. The Israelis. Abraham had a son named Isaac, and Isaac had a son named Jacob, who also was called Israel. According to their own account, the Israelis went into Egypt, and they went during a famine, and were eventually enslaved by a later Pharaoh. Now, an earlier Pharaoh had welcomed them in, but then a later Pharaoh rose up, a different dynasty, who enslaved them. And eventually they freed themselves from slavery and wandered around as nomads for a while, and then broke into the land of Canaan and overtook the Canaanites and moved in and drove some of the Canaanites out and exterminated some of the Canaanites. Now, the question comes up, was the extermination justifiable? I want to give you a couple of points to ponder about it. Number one, these people, not the Israel, had a tendency to come into your homes at night and steal away your children. And again, folks, this is something only a few of us who live in the United States can imagine, but it was done on a regular basis, and you either had to take care of these people one way or another, or they would take care of you. I mean, I saw a documentary one time about a king cobra that slithered into a Indian farm. And the documentary gave a universal truth. Human beings and king cobras cannot live together. One of the two had to go. Now, there was another problem with the Canaanite religion. The Canaanites, and a lot of ancient peoples did this, and this is something your book does not mention, even though my professor at UT did. Temple prostitution was a way they honored their goddesses of love, or the goddess of fertility. Fertility was a big part of ancient religions. And oftentimes, the children born from this prostitution, they would sacrifice. And this practice was abominable to the Israelis, and the Israelis used it as a justification for, hey, these people sacrifice their own children to their god Molech or their god Baal. And therefore, this practice is so abominable that it justifies us. Now, in our own American history, folk, I'm going to talk about this later. But Cortez, a European, came across the ocean, and he heard a bunch of hideous screams coming from the temple. And he asked, question. What's the meaning of the screams? Oh, these are people being offered as a sacrifice to the sun god. If you had been there and heard the screams and heard the explanation for it, what would you have done? I'll tell you what Cortez did. He destroyed the Aztec civilization. He stopped the sacrifices. Now, was this justified? I mean, I'll leave each of you individually decide that. Was there another solution? If there was one, I don't know of one. But I mean, this is something that happened fairly recently. I mean, well, like 400 years ago, 500 years ago, we might say, in our own history. 1521 was the year. So more like 500 years ago. Again, each of you will have to make up your minds for yourself, but I do hope that when you're thinking of the issue, you'll think it through thoroughly. In other words, look at both sides and decide. But the Israelis moved in. Now, they took the land of Canaan and lived there for a while. Now, I want to back up a little bit. One of my high school classmates is now a history professor up in Ohio. But I remember sitting in a world history class with him. And he said about the story of them leaving Egypt. He said, I don't believe that, and I'm a preacher's son. Well, I don't want to elaborate on that a little bit. If for the Israelis to have fabricated that story, folks, 2.5 million of them would have had to gotten together and said, let's all agree to lie to the next generation and tell them all about all these miracles that happened. Because again, the way the Hebrews kept their history was not the way the Egyptians kept their history. In the case of the Egyptians, only the scholars kept their history. And these scholars are known to have documented it and changed it any way to suit themselves. Changed timelines, changed descendants and ancestors. In the case of the Hebrews, they get together every Passover and they look around the room and decide, well, who's the youngest person in the room? And they'll pick someone who's quite young, but nevertheless old enough to talk. I mean, it has to be someone old enough to talk, but usually a preschooler. Then they'll ask, who's the oldest person in the room? And someone who still has their mind about them, but nevertheless probably an old person. They'll have this young child ask this old person, why do we celebrate tonight? And the old person will say, we'll tell the story. And they have been doing this ceremony for 3,000 years. In order for it to be a fabrication, like I say, they would have had the 2.5 million of them had to get together and agree to fabricate a story and pass it on to the next generations. And then pass it on down through the line for 3,000 years. To me, that sounds more fetched than just, again, if you've read the story at all of how they got out, the story is told in, let's see, well, there's a movie, The Ten Commandments, that was popular, made about 50 years ago, and a lot of the props of the movie, I heard, are still sitting there in the Libyan desert. They filmed it there in Egypt and Libya. One of the more expensive movies ever made. And there was another animated cartoon that my children used to like to watch about, and I forget the name of it now. Anybody can help me with the name about this? What's that?
I know what movie you're talking about.
Yeah, there's an animated cartoon about yeah. Again, you might wonder what made Pharaoh so stubborn. Simply, he could not denounce his status as a god, or didn't change his mind. So that was one thing that made him so hardened. But anyway, supposedly the children of Israel, with a whole series of miracles, left Egypt, roamed the wilderness for a while, and then came to Canaan, and eventually set up a kingdom under David, and another one under David's son Solomon. And then after Solomon's time, the kingdom split into the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. And that's where we get the word Jew, from the word Judah. These two kingdoms lasted about 300 years. Then Israel was carried captive by Assyria. And Judah was carried captive eventually by 100 years later, by Nebuchadnezzar or Babylon. We'll talk about these events later in the chapter. right. Again, these stories have never ever been more relevant, as was in the case then. The people, their neighbors, said that Israel had no right to come in and take over their land. Modern times, you have the same thing. Israel supposedly had no right to come in and take over the land that these people claimed to have been theirs. I do want to comment on that a little bit. Every human being alive today is living on land that his ancestors took from someone else. Now, being an American, I mean, I've learned that in tracing my ancestry, some of my ancestors were Indian fighters. Was it morally justifiable? You can decide for yourself. But the Americans today are living on land that once was owned by Native Americans. And as for the people who are so upset that Israel came in and took some of the land, have they ever taken land from anybody else? Every race of humans, every nationality has taken land from someone else. There are no exceptions. All right, if any of you want to comment, I'll be quiet and I won't argue. I'll let you have your say-so. All right. Okay. I hope I've made something of a point. All right. Now, the big difference that separated Israel from the other nations was Israel's religion. In olden times, most of your people were polytheistic. Now, they have originally maybe have been monotheistic. Well, Israel insisted that there was only one God, and that unlike that their one God was not nature. In other words, the sun was not God, the moon was not God. And in fact, they forbade their people from worshiping the sun, the moon, the planets, or the stars, or the constellations. And the river was not God. Instead, God had created nature, but he transcended nature. And this was so much different, it created a whole different worldview. And to me, where it's important, as I think I mentioned this class, the polytheistic worldview is not conducive to scientific endeavor. It's not conducive to technology. In order for a society to develop technology, you have to believe that there's a regularity about the universe and a regularity about nature that you can duplicate. In other words, put together another device like this, and that other device will do the same thing this one does. Put together two cars that are alike, and both cars will perform the same way if you put them together alike with reasonable parameters. The ancients did not generally believe this. They believed that nature had a mind of its own. The monotheist believes that nature does not have a mind of its own. Therefore, nature has to obey certain laws. Nature does not make up its own laws. Also, now, ancient religions were not associated with morality. Now, we're going to talk about a group of people who were, besides the Israelis, whose religion was. But morality had nothing to do with religion in the society of Assyria, Babylon, Sumer. The Israelis, they had their law, but in the front of each law was like, thus saith Yahweh, thus saith their God. So morality was something that started out with God, and was commanded by God, and God observed all of man's moral failings. This, again, was a belief that they came upon as unique to them. Now, the ancient peoples tended to believe in an afterlife, and it may surprise you to learn that the ancient Israelis almost never talked of an afterlife, at least not in their sacred writings. Now, by the time of Christ, they did talk about an afterlife, but throughout most of the writings, it's all the here and now, this life only, with little regard for an afterlife. Um, all right. Again, to me, the Israelis are very important people. I'm going to jump ahead in their history a little bit. After they were deported to Assyria, we don't know where the northern kingdom went to. The best theory I read was that the river they went to, which is unidentified, was a river in Russia, and a group of Jews have been found living in that river, the Volga River, I believe, which was pretty far away, and they never found their way back. As for the ones deported by Nebuchadnezzar, a generation later, they found their way back, as some of them found their way back to Judea and reestablished the kingdom of Judea. And they were there. They were conquered for a while by, they were taken in by Alexander. Alexander did not fight them, but they were taken in by Alexander's empire. They were conquered for a while by the Syrian empire to the north. They were conquered for a while by the Egyptian empire to the south. Then they obtained independence under a group of people. Let's see, I can't think of the name of the family, but a ruling family took over, and they gave them their independence. Can anybody think of the name of that group? Anyway, then they were eventually conquered by the Romans. And they would remain part of the Roman Empire until the Roman Empire fell. Eventually the Romans drove them completely out of Judea and scattered them. And they were to remain scattered until the year 1948, when some of them came back and reestablished the country in their old homeland of Israel. And the rest is for another chapter later on. All right. We'll move on then, unless anybody has any comments. Okay. Assyria. After the fall of the Hittite Empire, it was to be 500 years before another empire came on the scene. And by the way, the Israeli prophets would tell their people, would warn them, there's going to be a big empire come on the scene. They're going to carry you captive if you don't forsake your sins. Anyway, the first of the empires after the 500-year period of no big empire was Assyria. They are remembered for their use of iron weapons. They did not invent, they did not discover iron, but they used iron weapons. They're also remembered for, among other things, for their cruelty. Now, Assyria, as I've already mentioned, they carried away the northern kingdom of Israel. All right, here is the purpose of that, folk. Assyria and Babylon did the same thing. The Hittites, other ancient groups known to have done. What they would do, they would come into a society, conquer it, and then deport the upper classes. You might say, what's significant about this? Well, only the upper classes were educated. And it was believed if they deported the upper classes, the lower classes would never be able to unite themselves or organize themselves to form a rebellion. That way they would leave people in the land. I mean, after all, they wanted these people alive so they could collect tax and tribute from them. So they would deport the upper classes and leave the ordinary people then behind. And the Assyrians did this to numerous ancient peoples. And also it was the idea that if these people are scattered, so they would take away people from this town and send some of them to a city 400 miles away, some of them to a city 600 miles away, and some of them to a different city on the opposite side of where the others were sent. But basically they would scatter them out. And it was hoped that over a few generations, these people who were scattered would lose their identities, forget who they were, and become loyal subjects to the Assyrian Empire. The Jews never forgot who they were, the ones in Judea at least, and did not assimilate very well with the local population. The Assyrians also fought a war with Nubia, which we're going to mention again when we come back to Nubia, but they fought a war with Nubia. Now, I want to say this about Assyria. I have had a fascination for the Assyrians for some years. The Assyrians still exist. You don't hear much about them except one time a bunch of Assyrian terrorists seized a few hostages. That's been about 40 years ago. But there are known to be 10 million Assyrians in the world today. They live in Iraq. Well, you hear about the Kurds. No, they're not the Kurds, but they're a special group who somewhat maintain a low identity. They have not converted to Islam. They did convert to Christianity, but unlike others, they did not convert to Islam. So they're still around. And again, they remember for their, especially for their cruelty. Now, we could spend, I mean, there's so much known about them that we could have started a week ago today, and we could spend the entire semester on Assyriology. And there have been scholars who have devoted their entire lives to studying nothing but Assyria, and they'll devote 30 or 40 years of their life to reading all the Assyrian documents they can get their hand on, trying to understand these people, learn more about them. Soviets have also studied them, and again, there's a lot more that can be said about them than what I'm about to say. I mean, I can name some of their kings. I mean, Shalmaneser, Sargon, Sennacherib, Esarhaddon, Ashurbanipal, Adad Nereri, Adad Shimsi. When I took the course, our professor spent about 4 or 5 class periods on them. How that this Assyrian king carried this campaign. Basically, they would, in the spring, they'd get a military campaign, go off and fight this group of people this year, come home in the fall, rest for the winter, get back up in the spring, go off and fight another group of people. This was their life. From one year to the next, from one king to the next, just one endless military campaign. Eventually, as is the case of all civilized people, they outdid themselves. All right. We'll move on from Assyria to Persia. Now, when we go from Assyria to Persia, we're taking leave from the Semitic people and going to the Indo-Europeans. In 1800 BCE, a bunch of people left Europe in droves, and some of them went to Greece, some of them went to Italy, and some of them went to what is today Iran. And they became the Persians. It started off as they started off as the Medes, but I'm not going to ask you about the Medes. But then the Medes eventually became the Persians. Their most famous ruler is Cyrus the Great. Now, as is the case of all these rulers, Cyrus was a conqueror. It's believed that Cyrus was somewhat handpicked by his wife. Hey, you're a king, you should go out and conquer other kings. So even though he didn't really wish to, he went out and conquered and built up an empire that was far bigger than the Babylonian or Assyrian empire had ever been. And the empire he built up lasted some 200 years. Cyrus is remembered, among other things, for allowing these conquered peoples to return to their homeland, including the Jews. In the first year of his reign, he issued a decree that all peoples who had been deported by the former empire, particularly the Assyrian and Babylonian empires, could return back to the land of their ancestors. And they did, some of them at least did, and the Jews returned. He also issued a decree that the Jews should be allowed to rebuild their wall and rebuild their temple. In other words, you might say these other men were so insecure they wouldn't dare let the conquered peoples rebuild the nation. But Cyrus felt like he had little to worry about. In fact, well, I'll tell you about Cyrus's personal life. As was the story of Moses and Sargon. Supposedly when Cyrus was a baby, he was sent in a basket to drown, and some shepherds found him and reared him up. And they realized that he was the grandson of the king. Well, Cyrus grew up, returned back to the palace of his grandfather, who was still king, and overthrew his grandfather. But, according to he did not kill his grandfather. Instead, he let his grandfather have free reign. You're not king anymore, I am. But, in other words, a very lenient man, and as such, he did not create a whole lot of enemies in his time. Very lenient. He got the people on his side by allowing the ones who had been displaced to return home. And he even got the Jews to like him. The prophet Isaiah had a whole lot of good stuff to say about him. After Cyrus, there came a few other emperors after him. I'm not going to ask you to remember their names. And yes, I learned them. I mean, Artaxerxes, Darius. Now, we'll be running into some of these names when we talk about Greek history, because the Persians engaged in a war with the Greeks. But we're going to instead turn to Persian religion. Unlike other ancient peoples, Persian religion seems to have been monotheistic. Their god was known as Ahura Mazda, and their founding prophet was a man named Zoroaster. Now, the last time I researched Zoroaster, there has even been a question as to whether or not this man ever existed. Originally, they said he probably lived about 600 BCE, or about the time of the Assyrian Empire, but now they put him back to 1000 BCE, and now some scholars are saying, was Zoroaster more a figment of the imagination, or was there a real character by that name? All right. And a lot of people are wondering if the Persians did not copy from the Jews who were living in the land at that time, or if the Jews didn't copy their religion from the Persians. Now, an old theory was that the Jews, when they were carried captive, they copied all the ancient stories, including the flood story, the story of Eden. They copied it from the Babylonians and created their religion from that. And then later they were influenced by the Persians. But now it's known a lot of Hebrew history is much, much older than the Babylonian history. So, again, the fact is scholars are always arguing about Hebrew history, and they don't agree. Anyway, back to Zoroaster. What he taught may sound a lot like Christianity, or Judeo-Christianity. The main theme of his teaching was that there was an a long-term conflict between good and evil. And goodness and evil were almost balanced. And goodness would have a difficult time over, because goodness, evil, they were almost equal, but in the long run, way down, at the end of time, goodness would eventually triumph over evil. So the purpose of mankind was to make sure he was fighting for the good and not fighting for the evil. And again, this is connected with morals, something that other ancient religions were not until the time of Zoroaster. Now, there is one problem I have, a serious issue I have with Zoroastrianism. Zoroaster believed that once you had set on a path of evil, you could never turn around and become good again. Personally, I can't, even though I understand, it is known that only 1 out of 20 alcoholics ever recover and remain dry. Only 1 out of 20 drug users ever completely put it down and remain free. If you allow yourself to be overtaken by a bad habit, these habits are difficult to break, but they can be broken.